Hi everyone. I think we're just about ready to start. So welcome to the Nature Impacts webinar. We're really excited to have so many of you join us today. So in the webinar, we're going to present to you a bit about the background of the project and sort of explain its many moving parts and what it involves, as well as tell you about where we've gotten up to so far in the project's pilot year and the vision and aims for the future. We'll also share how you or your institution could contribute or become part of the project as it progresses. But just before we begin, we'd like to introduce our team and just do a bit of housekeeping. So you can see here the team involved in the Nature Impacts project. We're really pleased to have Dr. Mike Barrett with us here today, who's the Chief Scientific Advisor for WWF UK and the project lead for Nature Impacts from the WWF side. He's going to, in a moment, give a brief background to the project and outline its vision. Also part of the core team here today are Dr. Talitha Bromwich and Dr. Tom White. And finally, the day-to-day project is being co-led by the research assistant, Ailish Farrelly, and myself, Stefania. There are also a number of other members in the team who you can see here, including our team members from WWF Colombia. As for the housekeeping, sorry, it's too far. As for the housekeeping, just firstly, throughout the webinar, there will be sort of Q&A that will be monitored by our team member, Talitha. So please do add any questions you have there as we go along, and she'll be collecting and responding to these as we go. Talitha will also be pasting the important information, such as links and so on, into the chat, so do keep an eye out on that. We'll also have a dedicated Q&A session at the end, where we can answer your questions in a bit more detail. As well as this, we would really value your input. And so just before the end, we'll be asking via Mentimeter how your work might relate to this project. And finally, the webinar will be recorded and we'll share that with you via email, along with the slides, all relevant links, and a link to our global survey, which we'll explain a bit more about later in the presentation. Now, over to you, Mike, just to explain a bit about the project, sort of a bit of introduction, and about what the project we hope it will achieve.
Brilliant, thanks, Stefania, and good morning, everybody, or good afternoon or evening, depending on where you are. Yeah, all I'm going to do is just very briefly set out, I guess, the problem as we see it that we're trying to solve through this project, and what we think the output of this project can uniquely deliver that will make a difference. So the starting point, I guess, is the problem. So we have a set of globally agreed targets for 2030, and of course for nature that includes the objective of halting and reversing biodiversity loss by 2030. But it's pretty clear that we're off track for these, and we're off track for other agreements such as the Paris Climate Agreement. We're off track when it comes to the Sustainable Development Goals. The challenge I think we've got here, and certainly with nature, is that the actions that are being taken don't add up to the overall internationally agreed objectives. And my colleagues will elaborate on that and where the gaps exist during the course of this webinar. But as well as the fact that the actions themselves aren't sufficient, there's also the fact that actions tend to be taken in silos. So the climate world doesn't act in concert with the nature world, as seen by the fact that you've got two different UN bodies dealing with those problems. And also within the international agreements we've got, we tend to see lots of new commitments to action, but very little done to stop the dead weight of business as usual, which is driving many of the problems that we're actually trying to tackle. And it is the case, I think, that when we evaluate or track the progress that countries or businesses are making towards international agreements, we don't take account of the underlying business as usual. We only look at the positive commitment that they may have made. So why do we need a new tool? I think we need a new tool because we've got plenty of trackers, albeit that those trackers tend to track what businesses or governments are doing compared to what they said they were going to do, which is not the same thing as tracking their progress towards what they need to do. But I don't think we need another stick to beat governments or business with, or decision makers with. What I think we need is a tool that is more forward-looking and positive, and that can help inform in a transparent way decision makers as to what decisions they could make in the future that would have the maximum positive global impact towards trying to deliver our 2030 objectives. So that critically is where we're trying to go. This is all about trying to create a new tool to encourage positive future decision making in a completely transparent way. So it's for decision makers, but transparent to all stakeholders, including us. So I'll stop there and go back to our Oxford colleagues. Thanks.
Thanks very much for that, Mike. So I'd just like to start with a bit of more background. So the 2024 Living Planet Report, which is one of the most comprehensive global assessments of biodiversity, makes the scale of the biodiversity crisis very clear. So for example, you can see here that there's been an average decline of 73% in monotypic vertebrate populations since 1970, with freshwater species being hit the hardest, followed by terrestrial and then marine species. Now, drivers of these declines are overwhelmingly linked to human activity. And if these trends continue, then biodiversity loss will continue to accelerate. So the question becomes, where do we actually go from here? And that brings us the idea of bending the curve. So this figure is modified from the Bending the Curve paper, which was developed by Leclerc and colleagues in 2020. So you can see here the black line, which indicates business as usual, and we're sort of assuming that currently our actions might mean that we're somewhere near this red line. But Leclerc and colleagues put forward that in order to move from the black line to the green line, we need to both increase conservation efforts as well as large-scale changes to the way the economy works and operates. However, in order to do this, we need to understand what the gaps are between these lines. Now, first is the action gap, when this refers to the difference between what countries are doing right now and the commitments that they have already made. Secondly, we need to understand the commitment gap. These are the gaps between current national commitments and what countries have signed up to in the GBF targets. And lastly, we need to understand the ambition gap. So this refers to the gap between the GBF targets and what would actually be required to get to the green line of halting and reversing biodiversity loss. But how do we get from this red line to the green line? Now, the context of every country is different, and so we need to look carefully at what commitments have already been made, what actions are already being taken, and then assess how resources should be prioritized towards actions that will be the most effective at addressing global biodiversity loss. We next need expertise in each country when it comes to assessing these priorities. As well as this, we shouldn't start from scratch. We need to build on the existing initiatives that already help us understand the current gaps and opportunities for action at the national level. So, the vision of Nature Impacts is to be a forward-looking framework to support countries in prioritizing the most impactful and context-appropriate actions and commitments for nature recovery. So what does this need to involve? It needs to be led by in-country experts with diverse expertise, because these are the people who can best understand the priorities of the nation. Secondly, as I've previously mentioned, we need to build on what already exists. There are already many existing initiatives, datasets, and trackers, and this project aims to bring them together. Thirdly, we need to, sorry, did the slides go? Sorry about that. So thirdly, we need to recognize that action for nature also depends on actions taken to address climate change and human well-being, and that they are all interlinked. And finally, we need to account for the impacts of nations on one another. For example, the pressures to biodiversity in Colombia are influenced by the international demand for important agricultural commodities. And at the same time, the impacts of many European nations on biodiversity is driven by their consumption of products that are sourced from regions around the world that have more biodiversity. As no country acts in isolation, the Nature Impacts Framework must capture this. So how will we do this? Well, currently we're in the pilot year and we're implementing the project pilot in a series of steps. The first one involves exploring what already exists in this space in terms of trackers and datasets, and then taking steps to answer 3 major questions for each nation. So the first question is, where are we now? And this includes assessing the current state of biodiversity, pressures driving the changes in biodiversity, and the commitments and actions the nations have already put in place to address this. The second question is looking at what changes are needed. So this involves identifying the ambition that is required to meet global goals for nature recovery and the current gaps between promises made and action actually needed to bend the curve. And the final question asks, how do we get there? Which includes understanding of how each nation should prioritize its resources and actions to most effectively combat nature loss. Now, one of the key outputs of the project is to develop a user-friendly interactive dashboard, which will bring together all available data to assess national progress, highlight gaps, and identify opportunities to maximize positive outcomes for nature. Within this dashboard, the user should be able to see at a glance how well the country is doing, what biodiversity commitments it has made, as well as the progress made by each country towards these commitments, and what the future priorities should be. This then will create an evidence base that can be used by civil society, businesses, and governments to understand country progress and to check if the right priorities are being addressed. Importantly, the tracker won't just sit on a screen. It will also be used to generate country-specific progress reports, as well as annual global syntheses to maintain the bigger picture. I'm now going to pass over to Tom, who's going to go through the steps of the project in a bit more detail, highlighting what we've done so far and where we intend to go next. And he'll also tell you a bit more about how you can contribute and get involved.
Thank you, Stefania. And yes, thank you for joining, everyone. So this figure here shows what we think are the major steps involved in the Nature Impacts project. I'm going to take you through some of these steps now to think about how we might get to the prioritization, identifying a list of priorities at a national level for contributing to nature recovery. The first stage of the pilot is involved in 2 steps, and this is about compiling existing data. What data do we have that can help us track current progress and priorities? So step 1 of this was identifying the relevant global commitments for nature that countries have signed up for. This included looking at the Sustainable Development Goals, the Global Biodiversity Framework, as well as the Paris Commitment, for example. And then step 2 here is thinking about what data we have available at a global level that can help us understand the current context of countries, track progress against those relevant targets. And we've been leading a systematic review there to try and identify all of those existing trackers, databases, indicators, and tools. So next slide, please. Yes. Okay, so we looked across those different target setting, those frameworks and initiatives, and identified quite a large number of global targets relevant to nature recovery. We have grouped those into 14 sort of broader themes that can be covered by countries' priorities and commitments. These include things like area-based management, ecosystem restoration, species conservation, but also things around the biodiversity footprints of production and consumption, sustainable energy, capacity building and knowledge sharing, or the rights and roles of indigenous people and local communities. These are a range of targets across a very broad range of themes, but all importantly linked to nature recovery. And I just wanted to identify a couple of really key initiatives here. This is only some of the initiatives that we've started to identify, but they're important for thinking about the commitments and the actions that countries are making. One of which is the WWF MBSAPS tracker. This is a tool that rates different parts of national biodiversity strategies and action plans and targets as good, mixed, or poor. This is based on their ambition, actionability, and alignment of those targets with the GBF. And also compares those MBSAPs to WWF's MBSAPs We Need checklist, a series of more ambitious targets than those provided by the GBF. This is a really key tool for understanding the current actions and commitments that are being taken by different nations. Another initiative we wanted to quickly highlight here was the Sustainable Development Goals Actions Platform. This is a global platform to track voluntary Sustainable Development Goal commitments, who is committing to what, where, and when, across the different SDGs, including those directly and more indirectly related to nature recovery. And this combines contributions from NGOs, private sector, government, and UN bodies. And the idea is it enables data-driven tracking and promotes collaboration of actions to address these different targets. So that process is trying to understand sort of where we're at now. What are the global targets, and what is the data available that can help us understand where we are in terms of progress towards those. The next step of this framework is to understand where we're at now. What are the country level commitments that are being made, and how can we assess progress, current actions towards those commitments? And one thing we wanted to really highlight here was a project that is currently in progress called the Nation Action Tracker. This is a new project being led by the UN SDSN and BirdLife International, and they're developing an approach that can try and assess the national commitments that countries are making and to assess the actions that they're taking to reach those stated biodiversity commitments. This is really important for understanding the current actions happening on the ground, where we are at the moment, that can feed into that prioritization process. And this initiative will be developed in parallel to nature impacts, realizing that the close linkages between them. So that can help us understand the current context, where we're at now in terms of action and commitments. There's also the next step, which is starting to think about what changes are needed. We recognize that there's a lot of work going on here in terms of modeling the impact of different policy options or different potential actions and the effectiveness of those, and how that should be distributed between countries, realizing that not every country is going to take the same actions to be most effective in reaching those global biodiversity goals. And just to highlight an example of a project like this, which is incredibly relevant. This is the FABLE Consortium, a global research network of national teams developing open access, science-based food and land use pathways. They get together groups of experts within a country to discuss different policy options and then model the potential impacts of those, to think about how a country might want to prioritize, particularly thinking about food and land use production. This is really important and relevant to nature impacts because it's relevant and begins to answer the question of where do we think we should prioritize action for land use and production. And it's important for thinking about priorities more generally when thinking about how a nation should prioritize its action across those 14 different themes that we've identified in those targets relevant to nature recovery. And that includes prioritization both domestically, so how to prioritize action between things like area-based conservation, pollution, indigenous rights, etc., within a country, but also internationally. Where should a country potentially be investing internationally in those different themes as well? So the idea is then that through this process, we can compile the data that we need to track progress, understand current commitments and where we are at the moment in terms of action to meet those commitments. Think about the data that we have available on the outcomes, the potential outcomes of different actions and policy options, which can then feed into a prioritization exercise where a diverse group of experts from different stakeholder groups experienced within a particular country can come together, discuss the data available using their existing expertise and knowledge to think about what the priority should be for that country, for a given country of interest. And this can help understand where the priorities should be, but also feed into an understanding of the current gaps and where effort might need to be prioritized. So in order to start to address this in our pilot year, we've been running a global pilot of prioritization. And this has been through an online global survey, engaging practitioners, research, knowledge holders, diverse stakeholders worldwide to start to think about what people think the current commitment level is like in a country, the actions to meet those commitments, but importantly, where those experts think that future priorities should be for that country, thinking about how priorities should be, how action should be allocated across those different themes and targets for the countries that they are experts in. This has key questions around countries' progress towards those targets, priority actions, and the output of this is a high-level country-specific overview that can feed into the Nature Impacts Framework, thinking about how priorities differ between different nations and regions. And this is a real call to action here. At the end, we will share the link to our survey, and we're really hoping to get feedback from people like yourselves, experienced with conservation, knowledgeable about particular countries that you're experienced in. And please do share it widely with your colleagues if you know of people who would be interested in answering this, thinking about the priorities of their particular nation. Please do share it. The survey is available in English, but also in Spanish, Portuguese, French, and Chinese. So we'd love it if you could please share that widely. The link will be shared in the chat at the end of the webinar. As well as this global overview, we're also led by WWF Colombia, have been doing a deep dive, a real example of how this might work in practice with these national expert teams. So a few weeks ago, WWF Colombia led a great workshop where they got together a group of stakeholders within the country, from government, NGOs, the private sector, to start to think about the adequacy of current commitments, the action to meet those commitments, but importantly, where they thought Colombia should be investing in terms of future priorities for nature recovery to help reach that green line in the figure that Stefania shared. We realize that this needs to be a collaborative effort. This is not something that can be achieved by WWF and Oxford alone, and the success here really does depend on collaboration and a bottom-up approach driven by within-country teams, just like in that WWF Colombia example, to ensure the relevance and long-term impact of the platform, but also of the priorities that are developed from this approach. And if you are interested in this, we really do invite you to get in touch. If you think your organization, the group you work for, or the country that you work in could host or take part in a similar sort of workshop. This is something that we'd be really keen to get your thoughts on. So please do get in touch, and contact details will be shared at the end of the webinar. So unfortunately, on that slide, there was meant to be a Mentimeter, which was not showing on my screen. And but what the Mentimeter was going to ask you was if you are aware of any existing databases, tools, initiatives, projects that you think are relevant to nature impacts, we would really like to hear from you. So if you're working on a project that is of relevance to thinking about future priorities at a national level across any of those 14 themes, please do put that in the chat or the Q&A. We would really like to hear from you, and to include those initiatives in the overview of what's out there at the moment that can help track national progress and priorities. So please do add that to the Q&A or the chat. We'd really like to hear from you there. The next steps for this project, we're currently in this piloting phase, doing this global assessment and piloting led by WWF Colombia to think about how this might work in practice. And we've been getting some really great feedback from that approach. We'd appreciate your feedback too in the Q&A session. The hope is that we can then develop this in a second year through iterative development to lead to some really good impacts, thinking about the priorities of different nations and different regions, and to feed into something like the platform that Stefania showed that can allow you to assess countries' actions, commitments, and priorities, and a tool that can allow a range of stakeholders to think about how their actions, how the country's actions are adequately delivering for nature recovery. In the short term, our team will be at several conferences this year. We will be at the IUCN World Conservation Congress in Abu Dhabi in October. Stefania and Ailish will be there presenting in the Nature Positive Pavilion. So if you're interested in the project, please do come and talk to our team. We'd love to hear from you. We'll also be at COP30 launching some outputs of our pilot year, including a vision for nature impacts and a detailed overview of the WWF Columbia-led case study. Dr. Mike Barrett will be at that event, as well as members of the WWF Columbia team. So please do come and get in touch if you are also attending COP30. So that leaves me to just say thank you very much for attending the webinar. We would really like to get your feedback and have any questions now. Please post those in the Q&A. I understand that Talitha's been collating those, and I'm perhaps answering some as we've been going along. Importantly, if you are interested in answering the survey, please do follow the QR code there or the link that will be posted in the chat. We would really like to get your perspectives from the country that you work in and that you're experienced with. If you'd like to stay informed, you can follow the link there to sign up to a mailing list. If you have further questions, you are welcome to email our email address there, nature.impacts@biology.ox.ac.uk. And lastly, WWF have been running a public fundraiser for this work. And so if you are interested in supporting, or if you know of anyone who would be interested in supporting, please do share that link at the bottom of the page there. So yes, thank you very much, everyone, and look forward to your questions and feedback.
Thanks so much, Tom and Stefania, for those presentations. Yeah, and thank you all for joining and for your questions in the Q&A. I'm just going to summarize some of them and the key themes that have been coming through, and then invite some of our panelists to respond. A few of these were answered in the chat, but just for anyone who's not tracking the answered questions, we had a question about how international trade fits into this picture, which means that kind of the actions and policies, for example, of countries like the UK, that can be having a large impact elsewhere, and how that's going to fit into this analysis. I don't know, Stefania or Tom, if you'd like to take that one.
I can take that one.
Go for it.
So yeah, it's a good question, and I think it's something that's really key to try and get at with the Nature Impacts project. Thinking about so an example we often think about in our team is thinking about the UK's commitments to nature. This is a country that we're experienced with. The UK has a very large overseas footprint through its consumption of products and through international trade. And so what we'd hope to do is, through a functioning Nature Impacts platform, is to bring together data that can show that, to show the impact of international trade, that can help inform prioritization exercises. And that may well be, and that prioritization will include where the UK should be investing domestically in these different themes relevant to nature recovery, but also internationally, recognizing the large impact that the UK has overseas. And you can imagine that differs depending on which countries you're in, depending on those different consumption and production footprints and the level of international trade.
Thank you, Tom. Another quick question related to that, perhaps Stefania, you can speak to this one, is how the commitments and actions of businesses are going to be part of this process. So at the moment, it seems we're mostly sort of focusing on the national actions and commission of commitments and ambition. Yeah, if you could speak to that at all.
Yeah, definitely. So at the moment, the focus is on tracking national actions and commitments, as it is governments that have signed up to the global agreements. But we all know that businesses and the private sector have a really important role to play. And so to start with, even though we're setting national priorities, these can also be used by businesses to guide their action. For example, if they're setting a biodiversity policy, they can look at what the national priorities are and sort of be guided by that. And it might be that in the future, well, sort of the priorities might become more specific to different sectors. Yeah.
Super, thank you. And then we've had a couple of questions sort of around the role of citizen science groups. So like how the engagement of community groups can come into this project and other approaches that are actively engaging people on the ground. And kind of as a related question, how large an organization has to be to get involved in this process. I don't know, Mike, if that's something you'd like to speak to?
Apologies, Kate, can you repeat that one?
Yeah, no worries at all. It was just a question about the role of citizen science and community groups and how we can actively engage people at a local level in this process, and sort of how large an organization needs to be basically to be brought in to be involved in this process.
Yeah, thanks. So, yeah, both good questions. I might revert to you and colleagues actually on the size issue. I think the broader point though about feeding into the process is that I guess that's exactly what we were trying to pilot with the work that was done in Colombia a couple of weeks ago, in that we're very aware that at the moment we've got a concept which has been pulled together by this sort of team of Oxford and WWF, and that's an incredibly sort of narrow group of people. So first of all, we need a global perspective on this, and secondly, we need to move outside the kind of the NGO stroke academic sector into a broader range of expertise, which has to include perspectives of local communities, indigenous peoples, and so on. I think one of the things that we are going to need to do quite rapidly is to review what we learned from the Colombia experience and what we can take from that to apply going forward on a broader, sort of more international scale to have a greater involvement. I think it is fair to say, and again, I'll invite also colleagues to comment on this, I think it's fair to say that one of the initial sort of challenges we found in this process is actually trying to find the right ways of connecting into multiple different global networks to get different perspectives and different ranges of expertise to input, and that has been quite a complicated process. And as I say, I think reflections from our also colleagues welcome on that. But bottom line, we know that this will only work if we can include as many perspectives as possible at as big a sort of global scale as possible. And this is all part of what we have to do now, building on our kind of year one experience. We move towards the end of year one and start our planning for year two. And I'd also hope very much that the events that we run at COP30 will be a really good opportunity to discuss this further with a much wider range of people. So in short, I think we're still very much in the learning phase in this, and we're also in a listening phase and thinking about how we build this into a more effective process for next year. But yeah, Oxford colleagues, please do jump in and add.
I think I can add one thing there that I think came from the learnings from the Colombia case study as well, is that at the moment we've been sort of necessarily focused on this global scale, thinking about these global data sets and initiatives that could feed in, that can allow you to compare countries' progress. But what's going to be really important is also including those national data sets and the national expertise from that local level. And I think getting to your point there about citizen science, it would be great if that could also integrate like national level citizen science projects that could feed into providing the data relevant to these different themes. That would be fantastic. Yeah.
Super. Thank you both. One of the other questions we've had is about the sort of themes that we've identified, and that some are quantifiable, but may require like multiple metrics or KPIs to track the progress, and a question about whether our plan with this project is to provide like a comprehensive picture by trying to capture many metrics, or to somehow simplify them for like focusing on some kind of key metrics or combining them into a score of some sort. I don't know, Stefano, if you want to talk a little bit about the work you've been doing sort of looking at the existing metrics, and then Tom, perhaps you can comment a bit on the second point about how they might be combined.
Yeah, definitely. So in terms of the themes, so even though we've classified these global targets into themes, we're still very much sort of looking at what indicators there are for each target under which theme, and guided by the GBF monitoring framework, and similarly for the SDGs. There are similar indicators for some themes like across agreements, but yeah, like there definitely the idea is to have as many metrics as possible, but the idea is not that we will be going out to measure against those metrics, but rather use existing data that has tracked against those indicators and feeding those into the dashboard.
And you asked me to comment on something, but I've
That's okay. So I guess the question was sort of across those, whether the goal, I guess you can comment, but as to whether it would be to provide a simplified overview of somehow combining metrics for each theme, or I guess part of this pilot year, the pilot years of this project, going to be figuring that out, right? But if you could speak to that a bit. I
think it's a really interesting challenge, because you've got these broad themes, some of which are more easily quantifiable. I think the person who sent that that comment is right there. Some of which are challenging to quantify in that sense, but we know that there's a load of indicators out there and metrics available that vary in their relevance too. So some are directly relevant and can quantitatively track a given target or theme, and some are, of course, like really highly relevant, but they're qualitative, and there's sort of more subjectivity there. I think that's why getting an expert group together to discuss some of that nuance, and then to assess priorities based on those range of indicators and metrics that are available, where some sort of judgment is needed to feed into that prioritization is important. But it's a good point raised that is actually quite challenging to overcome.
Can I add something to that? Because it is a really, really critical point. So one of the things that we're thinking about for year 2 is ultimately, but to get to the point, we've got a tool that enables the user to compare the potential impact of different actions. So again, let's take the UK case study. If you're trying to evaluate the global benefit, for example, of investing money to protect nature in the UK, as compared, for example, to investing money and political action in reducing the UK's footprint in other parts of the world, you need then to have some sort of fungible metric that allows you to compare the biodiversity impact in one part of the world with the biodiversity impact in another part of the world in a completely different sort of biome. And I guess one of the things that we will need to work through is actually what degree of accuracy or granularity do you need in that, compared to what do you need in a practical, perhaps more qualitative sense, to start to make those sort of those comparisons. So that's a key decision or key part of work that we're going to have to do for next year. I would absolutely invite anybody with thoughts, perspectives, and advice on that to get in touch with the project team, because I do think that's going to be absolutely critical for us as we go forward and plan for next year. And maybe actually I'll just bridge to one other point. I noticed in the chat, one of the other questions around there was a sort of a question of financial resources required to accumulate data. And again, obviously we need data to inform this, to help us feed into some form of fungible metric. I think that my sense, and again, I'm open to challenge and suggestion, but my sense is that the only way that this becomes a sustainable model in the long term, if it is not based on the idea of continually needing to invest more money in different places around the world to develop more data, I think we'll have to rely on publicly accessible data sources. And maybe the best comparison I can think of at the moment is the way that, for example, the Living Planet Index is set up at the Zoological Society of London. That is based on the idea that you can accumulate into a single database a vast amount of data on a global basis, but all publicly available and not at cost. And I think that's probably going to be the only sort of pragmatic sort of approach that we can take. But again, as I say, very open to challenge and suggestion on that.
Thanks, Mike. One of the questions we had talking about sort of next phases of the project was after we sort of did sort of mining of insights from the Colombia pilot, how that sort of expert elicitation, that side of it, how that's going to be planned to be taken forward. I don't know, Mike or Tom, if you'd like to speak to this.
That was part of the reason for running that series of workshops, was to understand how it might progress in future, what the most sort of feasible way of getting at national level priorities is going to be. I think it's still likely to change as we discuss plans into future years. But I think the workshop format did work quite well. The exact format of the data and how the survey works, for example, may change. But I think getting people together in a room to discuss priorities, to discuss the data and commitments that in that case Colombia has made was a really nice way of getting a diverse range of perspectives and getting people to discuss why they disagree, why they agree, and come up with that prioritization. The process itself did also raise some challenges to how we'd structured our initial survey, etc. So there's still some changes to be made there. But I think if we can get to a stage where we have sort of set format for these types of workshops that can help different groups and organizations run them in similar ways, obviously made specific to the country of interest, using their expertise and experience as well. That could be a really nice way of getting comparable data across countries, but also engaging a diverse range of stakeholders. Don't know if you want to add anything to that, Mike or Philippa.
Super. Thanks. Super. So thank you so much for all your really interesting and useful questions in the Q&A. And thank you so much for joining. Just a reminder that following this webinar, we will circulate an email with a link to both the slides, so you'll be able to see everything that was covered, a recording of the webinar, so you'll have that to refer to, and all the links for where to get to the survey, how to sign up to our newsletter sort of thing, our email list to stay in touch with all the projects. And all of those things will be coming their way to you. And thank you also for everyone who's shared a few recommended resources that could feed into this project in the chat. This has been really useful. So, and thank you again to all of our speakers today for leading the webinar. Wonderful. Right, I hope you all have a lovely day wherever you are. And we'll be in touch again soon, hopefully. Bye-bye.